This program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hey everybody, welcome to Watch Mojo. This is the Inside Podcast. I'm your host Rob, and with me as always is Ashkan Karpus-Frushan, WatchMojo CEO and co-founder. How's it going, Ash?
I'm going really well. Had some Wi-Fi issues, so I had to move around, and look at the sad tree with no more decorations on it and waiting to be taken apart. But nonetheless, happy, well, it's 2026. We already did this last week, so I don't know if we could still say happy 2026, but nonetheless, in good spirits. How about you?
This is our second podcast of the new year. I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to today's episode because I feel like this is one that I might have something to comment on, because we're talking about the news cycle. And as a former journalism student, you know, I've got some opinions on the news. So let's get into it.
You've alluded to this. You're not a big believer in like legacy news, mainstream news, and all that. Like, you've been almost passive aggressive, like throwing shade at it. But I do want us to touch on that. And you're always welcome. I mean, nobody's gagging you, but yeah, we could talk about that. But yeah, news has changed. You know, if you go back,
big time.
I mean, look, the funny thing is right before COVID, I went down a rabbit hole and I was like reading the biographies of William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, Rupert Murdoch, you know, all these kind of, like, we talk about entrepreneurs and storytellers, like, you know, you had the prophets, you had kings, commanders, explorers, scientists. One of the first business-oriented kind of type of entrepreneurs were these newsmen, Pulitzer, Hearst, Murdoch. And what's fascinating in the last 20 years, when there's been all this disruption with technology, the internet, search engines, and the rise of these platforms, the power has shifted. You know, there's been this fragmentation, and the monopolies have fallen. And all of a sudden, a lot of like news fanboys, they look at like the traditional, at first, not anymore, not today, but at first, with the rise of Google and Facebook and all that, they looked all of a sudden at Fox and ABC and CBS, NBC, and all these guys as like the good guys. When, if you go back 10 years, 20 years before that, well, they were no different than the Googles and the Facebooks. The difference was the Google and the Facebooks don't want to be in the content business. Content, media, including the news, is a means to an end. So what people forget, and you know, you and I were exchanging some ideas and we were prepping the outline. I was like, let's just start off and set that table, which is the original Hearst was like a born on third base kind of fella. His dad was like a senator. His mom lent him $10 million in like the 19th century. So sizable sums to buy, I think, the San Francisco Examiner, if I'm not mistaken. And so you could argue that, yes, he had a passion for content, storytelling, and news. He was also the guy, yellow journalism, that said, you give me the pictures and I'll give you a war. But the point was, these gentlemen were not, I mean, they were good people, they had good traits, but it's not like they were these earnest individuals who wanted truth to, you know, see the light. They used it, one, being industrialists, being business people, having assets. They used the news as a weapon against their competitors. Hearst and Pulitzer, they might have in private sat back and had some scotch and smoked some cigars, but they were going at it like animals, and news was a weapon. But because of how distribution was at the time, first it was the guys, you know, standing and screaming in the city. Then it was print, then radio, then TV, then the web, etc. They ended up developing monopolies of local advertising, be it classifieds or simply ads. And so they built these dominant positions that were ironically even more dominant than the Google so-called monopolies. And now fast forward to today, news has become even more politicized, which sounds crazy. And the power has shifted to these big tech platforms that you could argue really don't want to be in the content business, but they need content to monetize.
Yeah, it's become a lot more complicated to, I mean, there's just so many more voices to listen to, and it's no longer an economy of information. It's an economy of attention. Like there's only so much information one can absorb, and it gets more and more difficult to discern like what is worth actually absorbing, which is kind of frustrating for a lot of people. You just bombarded all the time. And this is why we see like mental health has become such an issue. That there's just like so much going on and it's impossible to follow everything. So, I mean, that's part of my own disenchantment, really, like as on one side of it, never mind like what exactly the companies are trying to do and how maybe it's, I mean, what you said about the origins is completely valid and everything. I think I just discovered how corporate news was like later on at a certain point and then became really turned off by it as I was studying, you know?
Yeah, I mean, corporate should be a neutral term. I know you're not using it in a good term. And I became an entrepreneur because there's much more I criticize about corporations than I love, but I'm a capitalist. I like to think I'm an ethical capitalist. But I saw that early on in my career when I would sit down sometimes with a journalist and I would see like a newspaper journalist would take the time to ask questions. But still, when the finished article was out, there was some false, not malicious, but inaccuracies. And that was just normal. And then radio, you could sometimes go deeper, but even some radio interviews were like 5-6 minutes, and you're like, that's why podcasts have become popular. And then news segments were even more like, you know, for example, a month and a half ago when I got into looking into the Expos and bringing them back to Montreal, there was this huge difference between the interviews I would do with like podcasters versus journalists, written versus radio, and then versus TV, which was just like, you know, we talked for 10, 15 minutes. And it would be like 90-second segment. And I'm like, okay, well, you know, it's hard to get the whole story, right? But that's just the nature of the beast. But to the point you made earlier, yeah, I mean, I think there's just this kind of like, there's two pools. One is there's this false sense of wishful thinking, myopia of consumers who really don't understand that news is a means to an end. Content is a means to an end to sell subscriptions, to sell ads. Right? I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying going into it, that also explains why some stories are covered and some are not. But the other one, I think, is there's a difference when you have a stake in the matter, right? I wanted to ask you this about just the news and all that. Were you passionate? Did you have this visceral reaction even if you didn't have a stake in something? Or was that more like, let's say if you were, whatever, let's say you were Venezuelan and you saw the news, obviously you're going to view it differently, you know? So I'm just curious, was it just in general, you came to this kind of place, or was it more like if they were talking about whatever, like tuitions or, you know, employment, and it affected you more as a young pro?
So, okay, specific example, during the pandemic, for example, I really didn't appreciate the way that the news kind of was manipulating information in order to kind of, I feel like, support the goals of big pharma in like, you know, making things seem a lot worse.
Nothing wrong with that, but you were totally anti-vaxxing. Is that what was the issue? You felt like as a citizen?
I didn't like that. I felt like people were being manipulated, and I followed some people who did like independent journalists who did investigations and like went undercover and stuff. Like I don't know if you've heard of Project Veritas and stuff like that. I don't remember what the gentleman's name is, but he went undercover with reporters and stuff who talked about how in the newsrooms, their goal wasn't to tell the truth. It was to spin stories in a certain way. So like knowing about that was like major red flag for me. I was like, this is horrifying. What's going on here? So that's a main one that comes to mind right away because it's fairly recent.
Yeah, I mean, look, I get that, and I think one of the, you know, I was joking following the stories, horrible stories coming out of Iran. I was joking how one of the most blocked Iranians on X, both those who are pro-regime and anti-regime, because of one thing I said, one emphasis I put on a syllable, you know, like it's just crazy, you know. But what I'm getting at is I've always tried to be objective. And I think WatchMojo is a testament to that. We might get some things wrong, but there's no partisanship, you know, like I might like Def Leppard more than Guns N' Roses. I like them both. But if we're doing like the defining albums, okay, Hysteria, Pyromania are great. But if the team and the data suggested Appetite, I wasn't like, let's go for a talk and like fire the guy, you know, like it was. And so when it comes to news, I've kind of carried that, and it's a personal trait, but I've carried that objectivity to just doing analysis, research. But that's the thing is like in news, I just think people have to understand that who are the most successful brands. Why was Fox? Why is Newsmax really popular compared to CNN, which is super successful? But CNN has almost more of an identity crisis than, say, MSNBC, which was like a counter to Fox. So I think it's more the nature of the beast. When I read Rupert Murdoch's biography like years ago, you would have assumed he was some kind of Zionist. People assumed he was Jewish, but then that wasn't the case. It was maybe ideologically he agreed with some parts of it. But what people didn't understand is it was a business decision. He just saw a vacuum. So he said, we're going to launch Fox as an entertainment brand and eventually Fox Sports and Fox News, and we're going to rush to the right. So my advice to people is, understand one, that media is, media is a business. It's a conduit to sell subscriptions or advertising. But also, don't be surprised if NBC is not going to do an expose, for example, I'm not a medical person, why Ozempic is the worst thing ever. Because it could be that Ozempic is a huge sponsor, right? So now let's connect the dots and move forward. I think this is the power of the internet. But everything good to an extreme becomes bad. At first, citizen journalism is a plus. Let's just be clear, full stop. It's a great addition to the landscape. But I think with citizen journalism, at first, it was still people who had a certain barrier to entry, not compared to the old ways of, you need to have an uncle who works at the New York Times and maybe you'll get an internship, or in Montreal, if your aunt worked at the CBC or the Gazette, maybe you would have a job, but otherwise you were screwed. Citizen journalism allowed more people to kind of, research and write, but there was still a barrier to entry. You either needed a blog, which, WordPress democratized that the way YouTube democratized video, but it was still hard, Social media is the genie that's now out of the bottle, where everybody could talk. And then the problem is, it's not about accuracy. It's really more about speed. It's more about cutting through the clutter, which means noise, not even seeking attention. It's funny, some time ago, anecdotally, I was like, okay, I knew that a lot of people wanted something, and I like to make people happy. It's just a natural thing. So I kind of wrote an article about it, really thoughtful and this and that. Okay, it got some traction. It didn't, I'm not even talking about the expo, some other thing. Didn't go anywhere. Last week, some guy on Twitter just posted a short now I realized he was connected to the person who could make it happen, and that got a lot of traction. Now I joke that, hey, when in doubt, don't write an open letter to the CEO, go to the coders. But it just showed to me again the importance of brevity, something I struggle with. The importance of just quick noise, cut through it like a warm knife through a slab of butter. And I think this is the problem now, which means legacy news has lost that monopoly. It has lost that credibility. Its agendas are more exposed, more power to the Ellisons for at least caring about a media company. But I don't think that there's any hidden truths that the Ellisons bought Barry Weiss's company, who's now trying to reimagine CBS News, largely on ideological alignment grounds. That's their right. It's you have Al Jazeera funding content on one perspective. You're going to have CBS now steering to the other. So I just think it's more about, if you as a user, you do have the power now to, join that conversation, but it's just now there's really no barrier to entry. And speaking the truth, you could argue the paradox. Speaking the truth was never the objective in the old days. And even now, I would say less so, because it's more about just cutting through the clutter, which generally is not about truthfulness, but shock value.
Yeah, I think one of the main differences between the old days and now is that there were those kind of godly figures, the news anchors who were those trusted voices that everybody looked to for the truth. And you can debate about how much was actually truth and how much wasn't, but that was the perception of people at the time, that there were the Barbara Walters and the Walter Cronkites and all of those people who were just these figureheads, and people were, they were well respected. And today I don't feel like there are as many of those, or if any, certainly not to the same degree.
So I don't want to slander somebody like Walter Cronkite, who's an institution. So really not about him, but what the gentleman represents. Do you really think that they were this earnest, truthful people with principle and purpose? Or do you think that they were like the crazy influencers who spread misinformation just to get viral attention? Were they also basically just playing the game, manipulating the system, but the system was different? Like it's like they say in finance or in business, or like greed is permanent, but fear is temporary. Human nature is human nature, like human nature, things around pride and greed and all that hasn't changed. The tools through which you manifest that has. So when I see this sense of indignation, I'm like, okay, it's great. Everybody can comment. But to me, it's like, it's always been like this. And that's also why WatchMojo is not as big as it could. Well, many reasons. WatchMojo is not as big as it could be, because even at the peak when people were like, oh, you guys are clickbait, I was like, let me show you clickbait. This is not clickbait, Anyway, I guess I'm biased on that front.
Well, yeah, what I was referring to is more of the perception of these people rather than like the reality of what they represent. But yeah, like people like my grandparents, watching, and that was the other thing. It's like you would get your news at very specific times. You'd sit down for the 6 o'clock news. You'd get your newspaper in the morning. There was like blocks in your day dedicated to this. And then it transitioned to more of a 24-hour news cycle where stuff was always coming in with the internet. And now it's completely liquid. Like every second of the day, you're getting notifications. Any platform you go on, it's always the latest stuff. And I think, that's been extremely overwhelming.
Well, you hit a very important point, which is I think the fact that before traditional media did not just control distribution, they also controlled the timing. We've talked about this before with streaming. The main thing is you no longer have linear distribution. When NBC had, let's say, a powerhouse show like Seinfeld at 8 and Cheers at 9, if they slotted Friends at 8:30, it was kind of like that was half the battle. Same thing with news. You had to wait till 6, you had to wait till 10 or 11, whatever. And then now that's different, and again, that is why it's all about speed and not accuracy. Now, but you could also argue that, would you say more people are drawn to the news than before? Because there's more alternatives, right? I mean, you could just seek escapism in social media. You could seek escapism more in documentaries on demand. So I think this is the challenge of traditional media, that they are clinging to an era of media with news where the power and value of news has just dramatically shifted. And it's both as a category, I would respectfully suggest it's less critical to society, to the zeitgeist. But it's also that there's just so much more competition that even on a standalone basis, there's less people that turn to it.
Yeah, let's dig into the Barry Weiss CBS thing that you alluded to before. I have a very surface level understanding of what's going on here, but it's also confusing to me because you said that the shift is an ideological one. To me, CBS I always grouped in with ABC, NBC as kind of like left wing, media.
The truth is, I think if you ask NBC, ABC, and CBS, they would view themselves as center. I think they would describe themselves as being impartial. Whereas Fox would be like, we represent, if not the right, conservative values. And MSNBC is like, down with fascism. But so they describe themselves as such. When Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, worth over $100 billion, if not more, started to bankroll his son, David Ellison, who kind of, his sister too, Annapurna. So there was a family where the kids were not drawn to software like Papa. They were drawn to media. And to their credit, at least they're working and they're ambitious, right? I mean, I respect born on third base kids who actually hustle instead of just go living on a beach somewhere, although that's not a bad thing to do. But so David Ellison kind of acted and produced a movie, and then he bought Skydance, and to his credit, funded a lot of movies, won a bunch of awards, and built his credibility. And, people view him as a credible, competent executive, very ambitious, which I cannot complain anybody for ambition. And so he eventually realized that like Skydance had kind of reached its plateau with regards to how big it could get. And in media, when you now see the power of tech platforms, not just tech platforms, Google, but even the Netflixes, he realized he needed to get bigger. So Paramount, formerly known as Viacom, that owns CBS News and owns MTV and VH1, was kind of on the market because the Redstone family, when Sumner Redstone, another OG media entrepreneur, passed away, Sherry, the daughter, took over, who is not like a 40-year-old executive. She's a bit older. So she also had to think of transitions and to crystallize the value of this massive asset that over time was going down just because of shifts in technology. So Netflix ended up acquiring Warner Brothers, right? But after Skydance bought Paramount, which includes CBS, people were like, okay, what does that mean for CBS that historically was arm's length? Like Viacom, okay, maybe Paramount maybe could like kind of have a point of view on a given topic, but it wasn't necessarily like they would dictate to MTV or VH1 what to do. It was like, you're a culture thing, do your own thing. News is always sacrilegious, or like church and state, let them report the news, even if there's always a slant. But after the first few months, I think in light of what's happened, frankly, since October 7th, Larry Ellison, who is a Zionist and he's very pro-Israel, I think him and his son David, who are both very pro-Israel, they were like, and this is like projecting, this is speculating, but just for the sake of our audience, I think they were just like, well, yeah, if we own this asset, it's 2025, the stakes have changed, the media world has changed, you got all these left-wingers, you got all these pro-Palestinian voices, so they kind of wanted to take CBS in a more right-of-center point of view. Specifically, probably with regards to the Holy Land, which we covered on a previous episode.
Yeah.
So when they saw that the leaders, the editor-in-chiefs and the managing editorial directors, whatever, of CBS were still a bit too center for their liking, David Ellison went out and bought Barry Weiss's company for $150 million, which, again, not being privy to her financial statements, it was kind of widely assumed that they had overpaid just because they really wanted Barry Weiss, who was like, a journalist, blogger, writer, researcher, like somebody who used to write for, I think, the New York Times, I think got like let go, started her own company to her credit. So she had that entrepreneurial drive. And she kind of like got some traction enough for CBS to take her seriously to the point of buying, I think, her company, the Free Press. But it was also like, you can't pretend that this wasn't one incentive. It was to bring on a very right of center, and I'm not calling her right wing extreme. I'm just saying right of center, and a very pro-Israel Zionist perspective, which, yes, if you are CBS, a traditional journalist, might be alarming. And I think some people have left. So the reason why I think it comes up is not the right of center or left of center, because again, you have opinions and you have slants. It's more that if you are the company of Ed Murrow and the company of that was like, the Tiffany Network was like the gold standard of news and reporting and objectivity. Yes, if you've been working there for 10, 15, 5, 20 years, and all of a sudden you have this gal Barry Weiss, it's like, if it's not that different, frankly, than if whatever, Disney bought WatchMojo and was like, Ash is running whatever. Even if I'm super competent, I would be intellectually dishonest if I wasn't like, this is going to raise some eyebrows internally. They're going to have some questions. But my style would be to sit down, explain, saying, I'm not here to change anything. I'm here to help you improve things to the extent you see areas to improve. But Barry Weiss has kind of come, kicked in the door, as an entrepreneur, I understand. And she's like a tornado who's like, we got to be the news. If you are CBS, that is not what you want to hear. You don't want to be the news. You understand? Like, this is like the culture shock. Like, we have companies that want to buy WatchMojo, and they're always like, you guys could videofy things. When Time Inc. wanted to buy us to videofy Fortune, Time, SI people, when, all these other, way back before the Ellisons, MTV wanted to buy us because they're like, we need something like WatchMojo. I would say, okay, well, I'm not going to come and tell your team how to do their business, but we could certainly improve with video, with digital, with speed, yada, yada. So I think this is not so much like a right-wing, left-wing issue. That is one of it. I think it's more a culture in terms of an entrepreneurial person who is coming in and kind of chipping away, chiseling away at what media and news is supposed to be, which is neutral and very proper and whatnot. And again, if you're the news, you're generally supposed to be, even if journalists, everybody has pride and ego, even if you're supposed to not be the news, you do think you're the news. You do think you're a bit of a rock star. Journalists they're human beings. But so I think it's a fascinating case study of when a traditional organization acquires a very small, nimble, entrepreneurial person as an acqui-hire and organization, and expecting that to go smoothly. And it never goes smoothly, right? So that's what makes it fascinating, because hearing her say we should drive the news and produce things that are viral, it's not that much crazier than when, let's say, NBC was like, you know what, Jimmy Fallon, yeah, okay, you're going to produce a show that looks like the show of Carson or Leno, but we're going to change it like bottom up instead of top down, because we want to program for YouTube. We want to have skits or sketches or segments, actually, that could go viral. So not absolving her, what she's doing, what she's trying to do is no different than what NBC does with Fallon and Colbert did with his show, to come up with like episodes for digital. But when it's news, it's like sacrilegious. It's a bit weird to say that. You know, you could wink, hint at that. But I understand all sides, which is why I'm so blocked by people.
Wasn't one of the big points of contention what happened with 60 Minutes episode that was pulled, right? Like shortly before airing, that was dealing with some prison or something, there was like an expose, and then there was concerns about what the administration would think about this, and that's why it was kind of pulled. And then people were like, oh, well, she's just pandering to the White House, basically.
Yeah, so let's be fair. I understand. Let's start off, and this isn't going to be too much both sidism. But at the onset, I understand if she comes in, or anybody. It's not about her, but if anybody comes as like a new leader and wants to improve, I understand why it does take confidence, assertiveness, boldness to say, "Hey, wait, there's a problem." You know, it's like you're a chef. Think of Gordon Ramsay. Just because the plate has been served, like tabled, like it's presented, but if you notice that there's a hair in the chicken, you don't send it out to the client just because it's been tabled or plated. Sorry, not tabled, like plated. You should have the courage to say, hey, sir, the client, there's been a delay. We'll have you something. Can I get you a drink in the meantime, right? So I don't blame her for that if there was, and I don't know the specifics to go if it was fair or not, but I think that is a good trait as a leader. I think you don't want to just be like, hey, there's a big pile of poop on this hamburger, but it's all good, right? So that I think is good. The problem is, given the sensitivity in America, given Trump derangement syndrome, given that, hey, you know, for-profit prisons, which was the subject, I believe, is a very touchy thing. Yeah, I mean, not that Barry Weiss or the Ellisons are seeking my advice. Even my team doesn't seek my advice sometimes. But I personally think I would have said, look, because 60 Minutes is an institution, people expect this every Sunday. We'll release it. Monday, no, nobody should get too flustered. But maybe Tuesday, we're going to sit down and discuss it and be like, what could we have done better, right? So I think it doesn't help her by putting more bullseyes on her back for her critics to be like, oh, not just she's coming and she wants to be the news and doesn't understand reporting, doesn't get church and state, but on top of that, she's basically a censorship filter for the Trump admin. Like, that's where I think sometimes entrepreneurs, you know, yeah, it's good to go get experience. It's good to go read a business book. It's good to have your, like, you know, eat some humble pie. Because you don't want to give your denigrators more reasons to take you down. They already have enough reasons because you're just built differently. So, you know, was it more censoring for Trump? Well, it wasn't not censoring for Trump. You know, it's pretty clear what the causality was. But I think that is more of like a managerial mistake, because I think it's like the Streisand effect. If she would have just let it slide and discussed it privately on Tuesday, I think her team would have probably respected her more. But the fact that she kind of just said, no, we're going to not do this. Yeah, she probably lost a lot of credibility with a lot of people. And CBS lost a lot of credibility with a lot of people. And now 60 Minutes, I'm not saying this was irreparably harmed, but 60 Minutes cannot really credibly look at their viewers and listeners and say that they are not compromised to some extent, you know?
Yeah. Did you think that CBS needed saving in the way that probably Ellison thought it did?
So this is where let's go back. I think Ellison, Papa or son, were like, yeah, why are we funding an operation that's chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? Not saying that's what CBS did. Like, I don't want to be sitting here and going, that wasn't part of it. I think they wanted somebody who could come in and just present a point of view that they were more aligned with. And I think that's probably 49 or 51%. It's a sizable amount. But I think it's also that given that Larry Ellison, one of the greatest brilliant visionaries in business history, not just software, and David being clearly a very ambitious guy, they were going to do something. So that something was more the entrepreneurial acqui-hire thing. I personally think it was, I'll just say it, I think it was a mistake for them to not individually. It's their right if they want a more pro this or that slant. They're the owners. That individually is fine. They want to get entrepreneurial, mojo in, that's fine. A lot of companies do that. Like when NVIDIA buys a company, or like when Mark Zuckerberg buys some AI company when Mark Zuckerberg bought WhatsApp for 19 billion or Instagram for $1 billion when it had 13 employees, people thought he was crazy, but he was crazy in a good way. Those are two engines of his empire now. But when you add the third one, that you also immediately take somebody like her, who was going to piss off half of the journalists, like assume half are pro-Israel, half are pro-Palestine. Anybody you just parachute suddenly is going to alienate half. I think the trifecta was a mistake, and it's not a fatal mistake. It's not like, some kind of hack that is going to take them down or some kind of major lawsuit. But I do think that is when you start eroding these great brands. Whether you agree with them or not, CBS, the Tiffany Network is a great brand. And so you have to be careful. 60 Minutes is a tremendous brand, right? 60 Minutes before could have told advertisers, hey, you are running your ads for some pharmaceutical. We're going to criticize some other drug, which indirectly is criticizing pharmaceutical, but we're 60 Networks, 60 Minutes, Church and State. They cannot really say that anymore because somebody could be like, no. If you're going to self-censor for Donald Trump and you're going to slant for Israel, then how do I know you're not going to also, for our money, adjust your editorial? You see, I criticize everybody. It's not like I'll give praise, but it's just like, that's where I think David Ellison, young, like we all make mistakes. Like he'll learn whether he admits it or not. I think he might be like, yeah, in hindsight, I could have waited 6 months. I could have waited 3 months. I could have put Barry in these positions where she earns the trust instead of force feeding her to a group of which half is going to disagree with her.
Let's shift to talking about AI a little bit, because this is one of the other big game changers. We've moved away from AI in the media to AI kind of being the media now. And a lot of people can go to ChatGPT and just ask it to summarize news stories instead of actually going and reading it themselves. I know I do that. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's something that exists now. So like, I mean, what is the future of these legacy news organizations going to be with the presence of AI and how that's shaking things up?
Okay. Let's go up 2 levels. We've already discussed this on the AI episode. If you hire anybody tomorrow and they go, I am not, because you recognize you need a human, and they tell you, I hate AI, I'm never using it, you would not hire them. It would be batshit crazy to hire somebody that's like typewriters, computer bad, Google bad. So I think machine plus mankind, men and women, is the way to go. So that's that. 2, I mean, look, I think there is so much information that as a fact checking, as a, both accuracy, speed, it's a tool that I think news organizations have to use. But I think unless you are reporting financial results is critical, but it's not life, affecting critical. I think there are some things that you could just rely on AI, and the confidence level is like 99.9%, and the margin error is so low that it doesn't matter, and the stakes don't kill anybody, right? But I think every organization, every supply chain, every process, there might be some steps that are just AI or human, but I think everything is going to be some kind of cyborg effectively. So media should just drop news, should drop this veneer and facade and highfalutin, we are people. Shut up. Like your humans make more mistakes than machines, right? I mean, at some point, the roads will be safer with more Teslas, so to speak, on the road than humans who are, especially now, on their phone, distracted, giving the finger. It's just like, don't bullshit me. Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. But so I think the issue is disclosure, right? How much do you, as a viewer, as a reader, as a listener, want and need to know, what is the what was AI, what was not. So it's like anything else. I think so long as you disclose it, you're kind of absolving yourself of any wrongdoing. But again, I think we are now in a world where everything that you see that stands out, you should unfortunately just ask yourself, is this AI? Not that you should not consume it, but before you add your 2 cents. What I mean by that is, remember that pyramid when we used to talk about Dig before Reddit? There was Dig, they were like concurrent. A lot of people that would talk about this at the time, Web 2.0, they were like, there's 1% who are really the creators and producers of content. And then there might be 10% who will comment and share. But then there's like 90% that are kind of silent. That 90% drives your viewership, ergo your advertising dollars, your metrics that you sell to ads to investors. So the problem is that it's not just AI, it's because of that pyramid. You're going to have 1% that historically were the content producers. That number will grow because of AI, because you don't need to write. You don't need to be a videographer. You can master these tools. So that number at the top is going to grow considerably. That 9 or 10% that were the heavy sharers and retweeters and all that, they are going to become more important, if you think about it, as a kind of filter, the wisdom of the crowds. There's a fundamental difference if I were to see whatever, let's just talk about something different, something, some kid being pushed. I don't want to talk about it, just random. So there's a fundamental difference if I share that comment and go, first of all, check if it's AI or not, but then put context around it, versus the 90% that might go down to 85 or 80%, but it's not going to go down to 10, The mass majority of people that are the lifeline and the blood that pumps of the media ecosystem, they're not going to really think about that. They're just going to consume it, and that's going to shape their opinions of things. So, I hate the word futurist. Bullshit. Nobody really knows. You could guess, and you're usually right. You're sometimes wrong. The world has changed, and it will continue to change. And obviously, the younger generations that kind of step up and become creators or consumers or sharers of media, it's going to look very different. And I think if you now go back to the initial theme here, if you're CBS, the genie's left, the horse is out the barn. There's nothing you could do because you're not even equipped for this new reality of just social media. And now you have to compete with AI. Good luck, So go.
The silver lining that I see in all of this is that there is still value in whatever brand trust remains with these companies, because it's not about reporting on breaking news anymore. They're beaten by anybody with a cell phone who's posting to X or TikTok, right? So it's about verifying what emerges as breaking news rather than actually breaking the news themselves. And that might be the only area where they can come ahead, because they do have that established like brand credibility to at least some people, like depending on where they stand. So I think that's where the value is. That the amount of slop out there might actually help the media companies, because they're the ones who are going to sift through it all and kind of disseminate the information.
But this is the thing. I personally think maybe the new generation that works at media companies will be kind of wired to do that. I think if you're a traditional journalist, it's beneath you. You're not even going to bother. And that's problematic, because you're right. Fact checking is part of it. But you made an earlier point that I want to go to. I feel the most powerful thing that's going to make Elon Musk very happy, but the most powerful platform in news, in my humble opinion, is actually social audio. So during the pandemic, Clubhouse, which kind of grew because of the pandemic, but then it kind of fizzled like many early adopters. And that's what I've said. You got to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of consumer behavior. You can't be 10 steps ahead. And they got a bump because of COVID, so they were kind of screwed. But Spaces on X, which I really got into after October 7th, both regarding the conflict and then also listening to more Iranians inside and outside to kind of be like, okay, I've read a lot and I've written a lot and I've analyzed a lot, but let's actually go hear people, not just media, distill it and curate it. if you think about it, if like Israel sends a bunch of missiles into Hezbollah territory in southern Lebanon, and you have a citizen journalist or just a citizen who's on the ground, historically, I mean, you had to wait for a journalist to show up with a notepad or like some kind of professional level camera. Today, that guy could be telling you what's happening, ideally with video as well, so it's you see the proof, and he's on the ground, and all he needs is a phone and internet connection, which is pretty much universal. You know, God forbid, when there's like a fire or some kind of, you know, even natural disaster or some kind of calamity, it's a game changer, right? And it's funny because last year I looked at building like a CNN of the 2020s, which would have been like a network of, you know, these social audio experts who are all over the world, and who could kind of come in. And then if you think of WatchMojo's expertise, given B-roll and how we could mash it up, we could then pull video to kind of complement their audio, or ideally they would also show video. And I think this is why Iran cut off the internet this week. Well, the Islamic Republic of Iran cut off the internet because, you know, more so than ever, mobile and video and social has become really the antidote to dictatorships and injustice.
You think the future is more like people subscribing to individuals that they trust or smaller groups rather than, you know, big networks? Because, you know, for the reasons that we mentioned before.
So what's funny is like when I started to chat with a lot of Iranians, it was like if I didn't repeat their talk, you know, their perspective, I don't want to say talking points, but which was based on their experience, which I empathized with, they would be like, oh, you must be a regime or you must be an Israeli asset. I was like, that is the only reason I actually told people. I'm like, WatchMojo is very successful. This is what WatchMojo is worth. Like, you have to be a moron to think I'm paid by anybody. Like, that was why I was a bit like, not scared, but I was like, this is becoming tedious. Maybe they do. But I also realized why, because yes, there are a lot of people that you think are well-intentioned people, but I'm going to be honest with you. If either, and just let me say it happens on both sides. If after 10/7, the Israeli government invites a citizen journalism, or Hezbollah, Qatar, Al Jazeera invites a citizen journalist who is empathetic to the other side, yeah, they're already biased. It's a trip to them. It's an experience. Sometimes on top of that, they do get paid. Some time ago, whenever I would put something that one side disliked, they were like, did you get paid $7,000? Somebody posted that when we did the Holy Land. I'm like, this is an asinine take, but this is what this conversation has disintegrated into. So again, the kind of answer that like a media analyst would say is, of course, fans are going to rely more to individuals. And I think individuals are so powerful. We've talked about this. The most successful media franchise of the century, it's the Joe Rogans, you know, it's individuals. But I think you really have to be just very glib and naive. I will say idealistic, but like stupid to think that these individuals who need to pay rent and eat are just doing it out of virtue and altruism, because they basically get paid because of attention. The more likes, the more replies, the more shares. So obviously, if you post something preposterous, you know, I sometimes go, yeah, this is not just clickbait. This is rage bait. I go, they're just basically posting. This person cannot be this stupid. But I'm like, they're doing it because everybody's going to comment, you know, and that's how they get their currency. And that's so. Yes, I do think citizen journalism and individual like solopreneurs are definitely taking over. But I also don't think people should be that stupid to think like, oh, NBC is paid for, but, you know, Joe, you know, who was Joe Abu Hezbollah, who is now M. Israel Chai, what happened? Well, maybe they got paid. You know, I don't think their opinion changed. They're just now the wire transfers are coming from on the other side of the border. Like, this is my point, that in that pyramid, that 1%, whether before it was CBS News that had the bias, or now it's the individual creator that has the bias, that 10% in the middle that is sharing, you know, retweeting, they're also just sharing and retweeting in an echo chamber. You know, I sometimes share things that I disagree. I'm like, hey, not a point of view I agree with. That's why the whole online retweet does not equal endorsement. But the problem is the 90% of people that just consume, they were being fleeced and taken to the cleaners by legacy media, and now they are being fleeced and taken to the, you know, cleaners by individuals. Because why? Human nature is the same. The tools change, but greed ego, envy, pride, wrath, all of that, historical, has not changed and will never change.
There's that old saying about the news, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's exactly what you mentioned about like rage bait. Like that's been since the beginning of journalism, it's been always the focus on the negativity because that's what seems to get people's attention the most.
Transparency. We in our editorial meetings, I'm always like, let's still do the positive angle and we could do the critical angle because I like balance. But we struggle with that where we're like, well, we know which one's the people's choice, unfortunately. They want the smut. Not literally, but you know what I mean.
So let me leave you with the final question before we wrap it up. Who do you think you can trust with the news?
My honest answer is not actually meant to be pessimistic. It's actually optimistic and hopeful. Nobody, right? If there's one thing, look, I have flaws. We all have, weaknesses. I hope people, instead of like, again, not in the media, but like when I would cover politics, whether the Israel-Palestinian conflict or what's happening in Iran, I understood why both sides attacked me because I wasn't repeating their pure talking points. But I hope that if on their deathbed, eventually, that they're like, yeah, there was this one guy with a funny name. He was intellectually honest. There was a part of it that he understood and empathized. One reason why somebody blocked me a couple of years ago and slandered me for years is right after 10/7, they're like, do you condone Hamas? Do you condone? I go, obviously I don't condone 10/7. I said it was a horrible thing. I said, but if you want that to stop, you have to understand why some people view these groups as resistance. You have to understand the history. It's not me from my perch, my comfortable reality in Montreal to be like good, bad, evil. That's not how things are solved. In business, if I've had any success, it's because, let's say, you, Rob, have one idea, the other guy, Chico, has another idea. And instead of being like, you guys disagree, so I'm going to create a ring and you guys could go at it, that would be good content. I'm like, let's start with the 3% that you guys agree with, and then we'll worry about the 97 later. That's how you have success in business. In politics, you got to go to extreme, right? And so I really think that you cannot trust anybody. What is it? Not trust but verify or something like that, or verify, or there's an expression. I'm obviously not nailing it, but the idea is listen, question, research. Most people don't. And then sometimes some people are right. I might have an opinion that you agree with, but I hope you don't agree with all of my opinions. That's not a normal way of leading. It's not a normal way of living, So I think, to answer your question, you can't trust anybody, but it's not limited to traditional media or citizen journalists. You just have to kind of like develop a bit more of like sophistication, especially if you're going to be one of those retweeters, that 10%. If you want to be a credible curator, then, you might not get as many likes, but you do have to, discern and not be black and white. Unfortunately, the solution to any problem is in the gray.
I would agree. And thank you for that enlightening discussion. It was this was fun. I enjoy talking about this type of stuff. We should do more segments like this.
You can pick whatever you want to talk about. Like, it's people can suggest any ideas. You could say you suggested this. I was like, and I wanted to do this on X because I thought it would be on Spaces, but for technical reasons. But we could do a news, the future of news kind of like related derivative if people are interested on X, and get a lot of these citizen journalists to come and chime in. Because I do think that is, and I've said, if anybody wants to take that idea, like build a CNN, but I was like, these people are a bit too intense. And for me to say people are too intense tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, I'd be totally down to try out some podcasts on X. I feel like we might draw a different crowd, and we've got some engagement in the comments here. Not everybody's happy with us, but you know what? That's to be expected, and even encouraged. Again,
because we didn't repeat just one talking point. Shocking. Good for you. Like, how does that solve your problems in life?
People like to hear stuff that they agree with. I mean, what are you gonna say?
Yeah.
Anyways, we'll leave it at that.
The closing image of all these should be the Drewski. All right.
Cool. Well, take it easy, Ash. We'll see you again next week. And thanks to everybody for watching. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.
Cheers.